Christianity is a big deal in adoption. In my early 20s, I got a thorough education of this intersection when I worked at a Christian adoption agency. I remember meeting with women who were unsure of what to do with their pregnancies and how they prayed to God that He would create a way for them to keep their child. And then I would travel to my next meeting where the prospective adoptive parents would tell me that they prayed to God that He would allow that same child to become theirs. I was there in the middle, hearing both sides and wondering who'd win out. Or maybe more fittingly, who God would choose. I have one specific memory while working at this agency that will never leave me. I received a phone call from a hospital who told me that a biological mother had just left the hospital without making an adoption plan for her baby. So I went to the hospital, picked up the newborn baby, and brought it back to my office and sat there thinking about all the wonderful prospective adoptive families that I was working with. All of the 50 families that I had personally vetted and knew could meet this newborn baby's needs. So I had to make a choice. I called one of those families, told them the story, and asked them to come to the office right away. The family responded by saying, "Last night we prayed that our baby would be here soon. God really does work miracles." Now, I don't discount the power of prayer, and I can't definitively say that God did not use me to give this family this baby, but hearing her say that really caught me off guard, because in my mind, I thought, God didn't choose you, I did. I'm Angela Tucker, and welcome to The Adoptee Next Door. And for the record, I don't have a God complex. At the ripe age of 21, I took that job very seriously. And as an adoptee, this choice was even more laborious because I knew I was deciding where to place this child for the rest of their life. I tell that story because it's one clear example of how Christian faith is intertwined with adoption. And that's what I'm going to talk about with my guest today.
I did not start to question those narratives until I was a full-blown adult. Okay, I was so in the fog. I did not know what I didn't know. I just decided at some point that my adoption story was a done deal, and I went on with my life, and it took me a long time to ever be like, hold up, wait a minute. This doesn't sound right.
That's Tiffany Henness, a mixed-race, Chinese, German, transracial adoptee. She was adopted at birth to distant relatives of her biological mother and lives in Portland, Oregon. She herself is a Christian and has written a few articles critiquing the intersection of adoption and Christianity.
So, an important piece of my story is growing up in a town with less than 2,000 people. There were more dairy cows in my town than there were people.
Wow.
So this is small town Oregon, but definitely we were in a charismatic evangelical faith community, and so there was definitely a narrative, a story about adoption that was meant to like mirror our faith. And my parents would talk about it in terms of faith, adoption, like God wanted us to adopt you, you are God's special gift, all of those terms and phrases were used. But I do appreciate that they didn't go over the top with adoption being like the verses in the Bible that that have translated into the word adoption. They didn't highlight that too much. They didn't try to make that about something that it wasn't. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. Did you grow up feeling like you were chosen, that
Yes.
God chose you to play in their home? And
it was definitely this was where my impression was God knew all along that I was going to end up with this family, right? And because there's no surprises with God. God knows what's going to happen. And he foresaw that I would be raised by this family and they would take good care of me. And that probably wasn't something that was explicitly said, but it was something I inferred as I learned about faith in their context, which is predestination, that God knows in advance what's going to happen, and he has preordained things. He's already decided how some things are going to go.
Sure.
My adoption is kind of an in-the-family domestic adoption. So
That's right. Your biological mother's sister is your mom?
My biological mom was distant cousins through marriage with the family that adopted me.
Ah, got it.
And yeah, so there was the story is that she was young, got pregnant, and wanted me to be raised by a family, a full family. She just felt she was too young to raise me. She was 19, but not ready to parent. And so she came and lived with them for the end of her pregnancy. And it was kind of talked about like she came to live with us to figure out what she wanted to do. And then when she lived with us, she thought, you guys are such great parents. Would you adopt my baby? I would feel comfortable with her being here. So I don't think it was told to me that like the pre-adoption stuff, it was matter of fact, but it wasn't packaged in this, that's what God was planning on having happen. Like that stuff didn't ever get addressed very deeply. We kind of moved right along to, and then you were adopted and you're where God wants you and everything is good. I did not start to question those narratives until I was a full-blown adult. Okay, I was so in the fog. I did not know what I didn't know. I just decided at some point that my adoption story was a done deal, and I went on with my life, and it took me a long time to ever be like, hold up, wait a minute. This doesn't sound right.
I think in some of your work, you've mentioned like having your first child biologically, that was a time when it was like really came to the forefront to think about. Was it that you started thinking about your birth mother and what she was going through at those times when you were pregnant and giving birth?
Well, actually, what triggered it was going through a child preparation class. They tell you about the birth and labor process, and then they tell you about newborn and infant care. But they had us watch a video, and they talked a lot about in the moments after a baby is born, how the bond between the baby and the mom is so important, and placing the baby on the mom's chest and hearing her heartbeat and her voice and smelling the mom, and all of these things are meant to reassure this newborn who's just gone through this crazy experience, of birth. And they were depicting this beautiful thing and sort of trying to reassure all of us new mommies in the room who are about to pop that our bodies like are designed to comfort and care for our newborns. So to take some comfort in that. And I was having the opposite reaction. I was not wanting to think about the moments of birth and right after birth with my child. It was like, I didn't recognize it then, but I think I was having a stress reaction to even thinking about birth and that first moment. And
did you know at that moment what that reaction, why it was there?
No, it took me a few weeks. It took me a few weeks. At first I just thought, I'm not one of those women who's always loved babies. And so it's not something I'm super thrilled to learn about. But then I realized no, I'm actually grieving. Like the feeling that I'm having isn't just, that's uncomfortable, but this feels like grief. And I was like, that's weird. Why would I be grieving this? When I did finally put it together, it was, this isn't about me and my child. This is about me and my mother. And I was like, my head exploded, exploding emoji, you know. And so I just dove into the internet and I was like, I need to find answers. And so that was the beginning of a deconstruction process of my adoption story, my adoption identity, adoptee identity, and even my racial and ethnic identity, realizing those things were connected with my adoption and what came before my adoption, which was a Chinese Canadian father that I knew nothing about. Mm-hmm. And so it was a hard time. And with my second kid, I thought, okay, I've dealt with this now, it'll be better. But no, about a month before the due date, that same grief came up and it was hard again.
And what exactly was it, do you think? Were you picturing yourself as a newborn, not getting that skin to skin contact right away? Or what exactly was going through your mind?
I think it was realizing that I was starting to connect the dots, realizing that what I went through in the first several months after I was born was a trauma and a stress that has been carried in my body this whole time. And I can, a lot of things in my adult life, I'm going to be 36 here pretty soon. In my adult life, I have come to the point where I questioned why do I have certain fears or anxieties? Why is this with me? Why can't I seem to overcome some of these things? Why do I ditch out of relationships early if I feel like it's going to go bad? Yes. What is that about? And I think when I started connecting the dots to, hey, the first several months of your life, I remembered a story that my adoptive mom had told me where she said I couldn't be soothed. She had to pray over me in order to get me to calm down. And she spiritualized that story. She talked about it like she had to pray against a spirit that was, maybe attacking me or something. I'm not sure like how she makes sense of it. I just know that she says she prayed against a spirit, and then I calmed down. And from that point on, I would let her hold me and I wouldn't cry all the time anymore. And she said that could have been several months.
Yeah. I think about how many adoptees I know whose parents have told them, you were very colicky. You wouldn't stop crying. You were shrieking and screaming all the time, all night long. And then there's like this point of demarcation where the baby is now like chameleon, appeasing, like quote unquote perfect. And I often think about like there is a moment of like assimilation that us adoptees have at some point when we truly realize the life that we knew in utero is not coming back.
Our mom's not coming for us. I mean, I think when you're a new mom, so first of all, I was just scared to death. And this is another thing as an adoptee and a mom, I realize I have a lot of irrational fears that something's going to happen to my children and I won't be able to stop it. So all through pregnancy and usually the first year of my child's life, I will have crazy, irrational fears that just sort of come into my head about, or nightmares. And I think a lot of that is really my anxiety about being separated from my mom when I was a baby. And I think that was the grief. It was realizing I had never grieved that trauma and what had happened to me. And as I am here holding my newborn who cries for me, who, I'm just imagining me as a baby doing the same thing, and that mother never coming.
Right. Yes.
And I'm surprised I'm able to talk about it right now without sobbing, because normally I do every single time I talk about it. Maybe I'm further along in my healing process.
It has become quite clear to me that the childbearing age and the early parenting years are pivotal times for adoptees. It's a time when some adoptees are faced with the reality that they could finally meet someone they're related to, someone who shares their same DNA. I share some of the same fears as Tiffany. I struggle mightily when my friends have babies, especially when the baby reaches the 11-month-old mark, because I know that was a time when I made the move from my foster family to my adoptive family. So it's really hard for me to look at my friends' children and realize just how attached they are at that point. It's difficult to see the reality that they know so much about their surroundings, and vice versa, that their parents know so much, every little detail about their child. It's such a difficult struggle for me that I find myself avoiding baby showers or avoiding the first couple birthdays of my friends' kids. I know. I'm working on this in therapy.
I think about this a lot, and I think what would be great in terms of caring for children in our world. It would be great to really convince people who say that God has placed on my heart, right? This is a common phrase. God's placed on my heart these children who are in orphanages, or these children who are in the foster care system, or these children who need families. Just place them on my heart. And to say, great, instead of spending $50,000 to adopt a child legally, what if you put that money toward the social justice organizations that are going to make more stable families, that are going to help keep families together? And you don't need to put your name on that child in order to save or to be a helper or to whatever in their heart they feel they need to do. You don't have to adopt them to help them. I think adoption reform is something that I think Christians really could be able to get behind. But I do think that it's a corruption of how we view ourselves as Christians and how we read our Bible that has caused mainstream Christianity to treat adoption and to participate in it with such little self-awareness. I was there. I had that mindset. I thought maybe someday I would adopt, when I was a teenager, and I was adopted and it was so great. And someday I'll probably adopt a kid too. I would say those things.
Yes, I've heard that a lot.
And
it's really strange for me to hear an adoptee say that.
Okay. Yeah.
I wouldn't really wish this experience on anyone. I only know that sometimes adoption is absolutely necessary, but certainly not at the rate that we've decided it's necessary now. And I do not want more adoptees in this world. So it has always kind of irked me. But at the same time, hearing you talk about it helps me understand.
Well, I would not adopt now if I could help it. And here's an interesting, I don't talk about this a lot on my Facebook or Instagram and where I share about, where I write my story. I don't talk a lot about this, but my husband and I, we do have legal guardianship of a teenager. And I didn't know anything about legal guardianship until we needed to pursue this. And I realized something. I realized that there is a way to care for a child that doesn't involve legally changing their identity, that doesn't involve, there's a way to care for children, and we can put him on our insurance. We can make all of his medical decisions that we need to do, but he gets to be who he always was.
Yes.
He doesn't change. And so now it's hard for me yeah, I would not adopt. I really have a hard time with infant adoption, especially. I have such a hard time with that. I know that sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but the way I feel about my adoption now and the struggles that I have as a grown woman who is finally catching up with 30 years of grief that I hadn't ever addressed before. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And
I get it. Yes.
And I know that there's a whole industry out there that's encouraging people to adopt as a way to care for children in need. When we were going through the process to get legal guardianship, our lawyer literally told us it would be easier if you just adopted him. I was like, wait, so it's easier for us to officially remove any hope that any of his parents could come back into his life and like,
yes.
How is it easier to adopt him? That's a much more severe change in his status than it is to just become a legal guardian. And I think that's because our culture has made adoption, put it up on this pedestal, and we make money off of it. And so the process for that is so much easier. I did begin to have a relationship with my first mom when I was an adolescent. And so there was for me a small glimpse maybe at where some of my traits and personality may have come from. But until I became an adult and I understood who I was a little bit better, I really couldn't appreciate how much of just my DNA, my genetics, my, whatever that was, had been driving me all along. I was taken home with my adopted family the day I was born, and I think that even though my adoptive family would have been able to acknowledge that, of course, you came with your own personality and you came with your own story, I think the narrative at the time, in the 80s, definitely was this idea that like newborns adopted are kind of, their identity and how they're shaped has more to do with the family raising them than anything else. I've had people tell me that like your identity is more about who raised you than your ethnicity or than anything else, And I guess I've realized in these past several years, as I've tried to unpack this, how wrong that is. Like, I actually don't think that my adoptive family is certainly not more a part of who I've become. Maybe not less than. It's maybe, an equal combination there, but certainly not the majority of the pieces of me. And that's kind of crazy to say because my mindset shift from 10 years ago even is just a complete 180 on that,
Mm. Do you give yourself grace around, I've heard you say a couple times, like, gosh, I didn't come out of the fog till I was 30 years old.
Yeah.
But
I do.
Time, like, if you don't have, like you said, you didn't find the adoptee community online until around then. So if you have a total absence of language to express this, then it really is like going against the grain to think that maybe I wasn't just a blank slate, that maybe there's more to me. Like, if you don't have any community to even expound on those conversations and kind of dilly-dally into them, then it makes complete sense to just move forward in any way that doesn't bring attention to this internal conflict that you could otherwise have.
Yeah, no, I do give myself grace. I think I definitely believe that I wasn't ready to confront some of these deep griefs. Like, I've had to deconstruct my entire worldview. including my faith. And if I had done that in my 20s, I kind of went through a phase. There were a lot of guys. There was probably a little bit too much fun being had. And I think that I would have been incredibly self-destructive. I wouldn't have handled the grief well. I wouldn't have had support and resources. I may have completely burned relationships just out of anger.
Right.
And so I think that it was probably for the best that I got to a point in my life where I was capable of learning how to handle grief and recognize it for what it was. This is a process. Yes, you will be angry. Yes, you will feel hopeless. Yes, but you're not alone, and it takes the time it takes. You don't have to rush it. Things don't have to go back to the way that they were. They never will. And that, coming to that realization that who I see myself as, who I see what I believe about God, like who I see my family as, all of that has completely changed. And there's been some loss because of that. Like there's been hard things that have happened. Like I'm not communicating with my adoptive parents right now. But this was necessary for me to actually start addressing the hurts and pains that have been there the whole time. I just kept repressing them because I didn't know how to identify it.
Right.
And
you didn't have the support system.
Right. And so in order to be fully who I am and embrace my whole story, I have to confront and face those things. I can do that now. There is a cost to it. Yeah. I don't wish this on anybody. But that's not to say that my life isn't good. That's not to say that I don't still have a faith of some kind, that I don't appreciate all that my adoptive family did for me. As much as it hurts to realize the reality of being adopted just means there are some things that suck and it's never it's not necessarily fixable.
Yes.
But I can hold that intention with all of the things I love about my life.
Yep. It's not either or. Yeah. And that's why I love being together with other adoptees, is because it feels like we can talk about some of these things that really aren't fixable, and that we all understand they're not fixable, but we still also understand we need to talk about it, versus speaking with our parents or general society who wants to fix it and wants to give us those kind platitudes.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's why it might be it's often difficult when I see the church embrace World Adoption Day, for example, and all the smiley faces on people's hands that they write with Sharpies, yet also having the same thought that you just said, where it's like, I don't want more adoptees to be in this world.
Right. I feel like the narrative or the perspective of adoption in the Christian world is so, I'm just going to say it, it's wrapped up in white supremacy. And there is a blindness. There's a blindness there's an inability to engage. But where I see inroads, where I see an ability to say, hey, have you thought about this? Again, you've got to use the Bible with Christians, because we love us our Bible. And if you're going to say something and it's not backed up by Bible, then we're just not going to listen to you. So when I read this for the first time, that in the Bible there's a book of Psalms, there's all these praises in the Psalms, but about a third of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. They're not praise. Oh, God is great, everything is great. They're lament. And if you read those words, it's like, God, burn these people to the ground. I hate them. Their children suck. I'm done with it. It's deep anger. It's just, you read the lament and you realize in our Bible, we are we're having an example of someone who is showing us that they can experience the depths of human anger and rage and just the injustice and like literally not wanting to love their enemies, but slaughter them and all of their grandmas too, you know? And yet, that same psalmist who wrote that lament will hold that intention with, but God, I know that you are going to work for justice. God, I know that I'm not alone. You're with me. And so what I'm trying to get at is with Christians, especially these Christians who are, their heart is triggered by this sorrow, this injustice, this sad thing,
right,
which is children who need homes. But instead of really engaging in lament and grief and letting themselves sit in that,
right,
they're rushing to, how do we fix it?
To the fix, right.
How do we fix it and make it good again? Oh, we just adopt them, we take them out of those bad places, and we bring them to our homes where we can just love them and give them iPads and everything will be fine.
And you're suggesting that to embody what the Psalms say, which a portion is the grieving, the anger, to embody that within the same sector of adoption and child welfare, in that same spirit of God has put on my heart to care for children or to think about children who don't have stable homes, that instead of immediately thinking about
how to fix it,
myself in the center of this to fix it all, to sit with the whole picture of what that means, that a child doesn't have stability right now. And that means that a family is deconstructing itself right now, which means that their community is, and all of those things that you're really suggesting that we go there first.
If we can, if someone who wants to adopt because they want to help with something that they see is really sad and tragic, if they take the time to understand the issues and sit in the grief and the uncomfortable space of, this isn't right, how can this happen to children, how can this be happening? I think that when we engage in sorrow and we take on some of that suffering, we increase our ability to address the issue in a more humane way. It cultivates a broader kind of empathy. We have a very shallow, in America, we're very kind of triumphant about the way we look at things.
Yes.
We don't have the ability to, but I'm kind of meaning white culture here. We don't have the ability to engage deep grief. And so our response to suffering is a shallow response.
So it sounds like, are you suggesting that adopting is inhumane? You had said something like...
Yeah, in some ways that it's done, I think adoption is very unethical. I think that the standard way adoption is done today needs to change. I'm not saying that all adoptions are bad, but we haven't put a good, honest effort into improving the things that are wrong with adoption.
Yes.
And I think, so if people really engage with the suffering, and this gets, again, this adoption is sort of this quick fix Band-Aid to these big societal problems, like you mentioned.
That's what I was thinking. I was thinking of a Band-Aid metaphor. Like, we're jumping over the wounds and putting like Neosporin on the wound, and we're just going straight to the Band-Aid, which then there's people like you who 30 years later take off the Band-Aid and look at the wound, and now it's festered.
And I just bleed all over the place. I just bleed everywhere. And so, I carry that, right? It's on the adoptee. This is something I will hold and carry for the rest of my life. And I think any person who wants to love a child and help them, if they knew that, if they listened to us adoptees talking about the real nuanced struggles and complexities of adoption, I think they would be like, oh gosh, like that's not the fairy tale fix we thought it was for another human being. And Christians have a real hard time. The worldview I was raised with, white evangelical Christianity, has a really hard time with certain kinds of social justice, like racial justice, like poverty. It's, you don't want to enable lazy people, so we have to be careful with how we do our charity. And we have a real problem with that. And I think a lot of it is because we're not close enough to folks who struggle with these things we don't sit and suffer with them. We don't hold that suffering with them. And so our response to how we help them tends to be, inhumane. It's not really seeing them as a whole person. It's seeing them as a problem to fix. I've been doing some research about the model minority myth with Asian Americans. Yeah. And so, not to get too much into it, but there used to be a stereotype about Asian Americans that is quote unquote yellow peril. They were dirty. They were, we don't want Chinese people in our country. So we passed a law that lasted for 60 years to keep them out. But when we wanted to change the narrative because we wanted, the US government wanted China to be on our side to fight a war against Japan, there was a committee that wanted to repeal that Chinese Exclusion Act, and they released all these promotional materials talking about Chinese Americans being law-abiding citizens, very hard workers, and suddenly the model minority myth started to just like permeate. This idea that they're such good citizens and good neighbors. They're quiet, they keep their head down, they work hard, they run good businesses, they're very clean. And that, reached its pinnacle during the civil rights movement when, they used Asian Americans against the civil rights movement to say that, yes. But we can change narratives when we want to. We can. And I think the only thing that stops us really is that right now, the way adoption works, the people who have control of the narrative, the power, and the money, I guess, to really shift that are the folks who are benefiting off the adoption industry staying the way it is. It's really hard for them to give up their very lucrative international adoption program. It's really hard for them to sit down with adoptive parents and say, look, I know your heart is in the right place, but before you get into this, like, why do you want an infant, when there are so many older children in the foster care system who need a home? Like,
That's where I think the power actually lies with adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents.
It does. Yeah.
As well. And in the same way that we're kind of recognizing now that white people actually need to be having conversations about racism with other white people more than people of color. So that message is kind of finally starting to take shape. And I think similar with prospective adoptive parents or adoptive parents now need to be the ones to say, wait a minute, because I think even if an agency, like I worked within an agency and I had these conversations with people, tell me in detail your motivation to adopt. And I would have multiple meetings about that, but the ball was rolling outside of control already. The only thing that I think would stop it is not just shutting down of the agency, because they would go to the next one, but it's those parents deciding this is not ethical, or let's think about why this child needs to be adopted in the first place, and maybe we can support that family to.
Who is it? Is it Jen Hatmaker, I think, who is pretty well known in the Christian women influencer world. I do believe she is one of those adoptive parents who is like, okay, guys, we need to rethink this. And I think that I see a little bit more of that now, but by and large, when I search for or I come across adoption content, adoptive parents who are out there writing books, doing podcasts, they get more engagements, downloads, purchases when they uphold the narrative as it is, right? So even adoptive parents have to, the ones who are out there trying to influence, even they are going to have to sacrifice and give up some of their popularity and some of their, in order to change it and to shift it. And I think they can do that. I think some are, and I love to see that. But right, in that parallel with, like, white people learning how to influence other white people, adoptive parents learning how to influence other pre-adoptive, like the folks in their world who already come into adoption with the mindset that it's the right thing to do before they even have learned very much about it, because that's just what our culture sits at. It's our default perspective.
Wow. Yes.
Right.
Wow.
But hopefully these adoptive parents who can help change that narrative will recognize the value of your voice, our voices, for complicating the perspective and complicating the narrative of adoption. Not this simple, quick fix that's going to make everybody feel good, forever families, all of that stuff, rainbows and unicorns, right? We've got to complicate the waters. We've got to trouble it, and we've got to make people confront that pride that's kind of wrapped up in, or that saviorism that's wrapped up in their heart's decision process. And so when I engage with Christians about the idea of wanting to adopt, I want to say, hey, your heart is in the right place, but if you're not holding with open hands how you want to help and letting God decide what that looks like, as opposed to what you want it to look like, your sort of selfish desires can get in there and corrupt your decision-making process. So you've got to hold with open hands the desire to help children and say, but God, I want to help them in the way that you want me to help them. And it might not look the way I think it should. So Christians, my fellow Christians, how can you allow your concept of what it looks like to help kids in need change? Allow that to change.
I want to thank Tiffany for chatting with me and for all that she's doing to, as she says, complicate the waters of the adoption conversation. There are a lot of reasons why children may need to be adopted, whether it's issues of abuse or neglect, but the children in these environments aren't the only ones who need support. I want to challenge Christians to not focus solely on helping the child in need, but instead to consider if God wants us to help the child's family of origin as well. If you liked this episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review, rate it, and share it with your friends and family. Once again, I'm Angela Tucker. You can follow me on Instagram at AngieAdoptee, Twitter or Facebook at The Adopted Life, or check out my website at angelatucker.com. This episode was edited by my husband, Brian Tucker. The music is courtesy of Marmoset and Artlist. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next week on The Adoptee Next Door.